Hello, my name is Master Yao. This is episode 19 in the Chronicles, and it begins a new series called the Master Series on the Black Man. Some time ago, around episode 10, we did a 4-part series on the Black Woman. This is the 6-part series on the Black Male. And the title today is Stagnation and Decline of the Black Male. Because the current state of the black man in America is one of stagnation and decline. And this decline has been going on for about 98 years. We can use 4 terms to define the current state of the black male. The first thing is that he is a refugee. Psychologically, you can define the collective of black men as they're in refugee status. He is a victim of dislocation. He was taken from one land, deposited in another, and there was never never a process whereby he was grounded in this new place. He has no domain there, no government of his own. He has no military power to hold on to things that he achieves. He has no significant assets to build a nation. At least that's how he started. So he's basically a refugee, and he still is today. Second thing is emotionally, the black man is indifferent. That's the sum of what he has become after this 98-year period of decline. He's indifferent. And he is indifferent because he's lost his main motivators. We'll get to that in a second. When you look at black men and you try to motivate them, it's pretty difficult. I'm talking about black men trying to motivate other black men. I'm not talking about outsiders. I'm not talking about individual men. I'm talking about when you're trying to do some type of a group thing, an organization, such and such. When you try to motivate a group of black men, they just look at you with that fluoride stare where it just doesn't register anymore. That wasn't the case even 30 years ago. We're going to get to why that is. But today what we're going to find is that black men are reaction-oriented, which is the opposite of what they were 50 years ago. They don't plan and take action. They react to what women do, to what the outside environment does. They don't act, they react. And it's because he lacks motivation. And what we find is that without motivation, the black man is basically form and not function. Without motivation, everything that he is about is form and facade, because only with real motivation is there function. If there is no motivation, there is only minimal function. You have to understand this to understand what we're going to say in the future about where the black man is today and what he has become. So, when we talk about motivation, I'm not talking about personal motivation. I'm talking about group motivation, subliminal motivation. And the sources of motivation that have been shut down are as follows. God is most people's primary motivator. And when we talk about God, there is no motivation for the black man, because the religions he's invested in are false. And they have destroyed that motivation. Family, another major motivator for men. But with the black man, there's no motivation because black female feminism has destroyed his family motivation. Another big motivating factor is nation, tribe. Again, here, black men have no motivation in respect to nation. Basically because all state governments hate him and are seeking to destroy him. He built his own nation for the first 50 years out of slavery. But, you know, in the rush to integrate, the mass of blacks just let his nation go to waste. They basically integrated into the white society, and the nation that he built just disintegrated. So he no longer has nation-building motivations. And those are the three major motivators that men have: God, family, nation. Without those motivations, black man has become indifferent. And it's hard to understand what black men are when we get to that point, when we start defining certain things. It's not going to make sense to you unless you understand this issue of motivation. Okay? Mentally, number 3. Number 1, psychological refugee. Number 2, emotionally indifferent. Number 3, the black man collectively is disillusioned because he is a victim who is blamed for the crimes against him, so he's disillusioned. And this false assignment of blame is so massive and repeated so often that some black men have started to accept it as fact, that they are their own problem, that all of this racial oppression and all of this other stuff is a figment of someone's imagination. So these people descend into self-hate and mental illness. He is disillusioned because he has made progress and significant achievements, but he has received no recognition for them, not really. No one gives him credit for the stuff that he has done, and he's done a lot. Black women refuse to validate him for reasons we'll get into. And white society refuses to record his achievements. Most of what he's done, no one outside of the person who did it knows, not even other black men, because those records are erased. Those records are not recorded. I mean, if somebody, gets a gold medal in the Olympics, yeah, that's recorded. If somebody wins a boxing match, that's recorded. But the main things, the big things, are not recorded. So the black man is disillusioned. That is where he is mentally. Number 4, we're talking about the soul. We're talking about his heart. We're talking about, where he is as a human. And basically, collectively, the black man is subversive. That's kind of what happens when you back up into a corner and after, you can't, you have not been able to get any place, you become subversive. He is quick to undermine wise leadership, if it suits him. He has a divisive spirit. His mental state is self-centered. In other words, he's in this I mentality. In other words, the group effort failed, so he's pulled back into his cocoon, and he's into this I thing. That's how he's thinking. I. There is no we. You see what I'm saying? So when you get like that, that's bad. When you get like that, you reject strategic thinking because you're only concerned about the I. Strategic thinking involves the we. When you stop thinking as we and you start thinking as only I, you stop strategically thinking. And when your enemy is strategically thinking, you're in trouble. He is subversive. So let's those are the 4 things that define the black man today. In other words, that's not who he is. okay? Before we can tell you who he is, we have to tell you what's happened to them, what's happened to him. What are the outside shaping and organizing forces that made him who he is today? And so, you know, to understand what we're going to describe him as, you have to understand the forces around. Okay, so you've got basically 4 words: refugee, indifferent, disillusioned, subversive. Those are the 4 things defining him and the 4 different levels of his persona: emotionally, mentally, psychologically, this, that, and the other. The black man is a refugee seeking desperately to force inclusion into a society which will not have him. He wants to be part of a nation, part of a tribe. He wants to belong to something and can't. After beating his head against a brick wall for 98 years, he has become indifferent. He now lacks motivation. He is disillusioned because his efforts in the past have not paid off. He has not received either validation or recognition. So he's indifferent. He's disillusioned. He is subversive. At this point, he is now rigidly opposed to any authority figures. He presents as self-assured, viable, and even vain, some of them arrogant, on the outside. When you look closer, when you look on the inside, well, they are depressed, they are insecure, and they have the typical maladies common to a refugee. Somebody who just lost their home, who don't belong to a group, and who have an abundance of adversaries and not too many friends. And so you can tell that he's in bad shape today, that he has a lot of severe abnormalities when you see the drastic difference between how he shows up and what he is. When a person comes up with a facade of one thing that's really, 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 really different from the thing that they really are underneath, that's an indication right there of a severe situation. So, you know, we don't want to paint the picture that he's a failure. That's not the case. In almost all of the social movements in these 98 years that took place in white society or black society, black men succeeded and made major gains. So he did a lot of stuff, he achieved a lot of stuff, okay? And when you look at, you know, individual black men, some of them are exceptional people. So, you know, the collective of black men is not monolithic. They're not all the same. There's a wide variety of difference between the people at the top, people at the bottom, and the people over here and the people over there. We're talking in generalities about the collective, so let's be clear about that. So, you know, for the most part, with all of this negativity going on, black men collectively made a lot of gains, okay, in this 98 period that we're talking about from 1920 to 2020. But there were 3 movements which really hurt him, where he made his worst, where he sustained his worst damage, and it was pretty severe, all 3 of them. The first is the civil rights integration period. You know, he put a lot of energy into that, and it ended up really hurting him. Integrating into white society was the worst thing that could have happened to him, and was really when his decline really accelerated. Excuse me. The second thing is the feminist movement, which he did not initiate, but he was partly to blame for. The feminist social incursion was a great disaster that basically, you know, killed relationships and killed the family, which was one of the last things that the black man was holding on to. the feminist social incursion basically just destroyed whatever existed of black society after 1970. Integration started the great decline, and feminism basically pushed it over the cliff. The third social movement that he suffered from was the social media phase. And I don't think any explanation is warranted for that. You know, when the social media, it gave him a chance to focus his attention on something that was, virtual and not real, instead of focusing on the problems that were considerable, which, it really helped him to become indifferent. So you got these three things that happened that really set him back. Civil rights and integration, because he was doing good before. During segregation, he was doing much, much better. Then the feminist thing came along, really just kind of was a nail in the coffin, basically. It destroyed the family, it destroyed relationships almost completely, and it put him in the Lazarus situation where black men and black women couldn't form relationships even if they were personally mature and willing to form relationships. It just was not possible anymore after the feminist incursion. They basically just made things so bad that adults started out way, way, way behind the eight ball. Okay. So what we find today is that in the last 50 years, black men have been living in this ring of illusion. And what we mean by that is that it looks like he should be able to achieve all of this stuff: house, wife, kids, business, good credit report, all of this stuff. But basically, there are roadblocks and landmines for any black man that actually tries to actually achieve those things. And so you got these young black men, 20, 21, running out here thinking that they're going to get all of this stuff. And then when they try, their legs are kicked out from under them and they fail. Most of them, they're 40 years old before they figure it out. It creates a lot of, angry, disconnected black men. After decades of struggle, the current generation of black men have lost their will to engage. And here's what I mean by this. He has lost his will to build when it comes to things like nations, organizations, institutions, families. He's not interested in that anymore. He has lost his desire to commune with God. He settles for religion. In other words, it's form, not function. He has lost his hope for real love. I'm talking about with a woman. Real love is, men just don't even think that it's possible anymore, because it's not. It's not easy, let's put it that way. So you have, when we're looking at what has shaped and formed the black man today, you have all of these catalysts and external things, internal things, or whatever. You have these external causes, which are basically oppression from whites and living in a place that he has no control over, lacking the assets and things like that. But we're going to find, when we really analyze this, that these things don't define the black man, because he already showed that he could overcome them during the segregation era. He did. And then, so we have these external causes versus internal decisions. And what we're going to see when we're trying to determine how the black man got to where he is today and why it's such a messed up place, we're going to see that most of what happened is his own fault. It's based on his own internal decisions. Yes, the external stuff was pretty rotten, pretty foul, pretty evil. But he already had shown that he could overcome that and build. It's when he made this critical mistake around 1920 and changed his philosophy, at least the masses of black men did, that it put him into the situation, he got off course and he ended up where he is today. So, you know, what happened? Black men around 1920 stopped listening to their leaders, Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, all these people, UNIA, blah, 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 NAACP at the time, all of this stuff. They stopped listening to these organizations. And they got this thing in their head that they insisted that they could insert themselves back into white society. They felt that they were equal to whites. They felt that they were born into America. The concept of continuing to build their own nation didn't seem like they would ever catch up to whites. In other words, they had built a nation. It was working. They were doing good. But they looked at what they had. They looked over there at whites and they're like, look, we believe we can insert ourselves into that, and that's going to be better than continuing to build on what we have. That was a fatal error. You know, their belief is that because they were born here, and they believed that entitled them to citizenship, that it was somehow going to be possible for them to sort of force themselves into that culture. And maybe this would have been possible if they were dealing with a compassionate and good people, but it ignores the reality that whites have proven they will never accept non-whites into their society under any circumstances. This was clear. This has always been clear. And it's never even more clear than it is today when you look at the big push to build a wall along the southern border. Whites do not want anyone else included in their society. And they will do any dirty trick that they have to keep anyone else out. This central false belief that black men developed in the 1920s was the parent of many other false beliefs which derailed the progress of the black man and provided the cause for the current dissension and failures. So let's look at the catalyst again. We take the stuff that we talked about before and break it down a little bit more. So you got, externally, stuff he can't control. People in positions of authority denying him opportunity, fairness, this, that, and the other. They won't give him his basic rights. Laws are enforced differently. For blacks, they throw you in jail. For whites, they give you a pardon. The corporate and retail economy is closed to him, open to whites. He is forced to rely on people who don't like him for his very food and shelter. And the media has always been engaged in a propaganda to demonize him, say he's a bad person. In other words, blame him for his own condition. So that's the external stuff. Then the internal stuff, is a little bit different. It's the stuff he does have control over. So he has post-traumatic stress disorder. He has his own little economic network, but he doesn't really support it or build it anymore. He's lost interest in that. He used to have media platforms. He's abandoned them. And then there's this question about epigenetics. In other words, negative genetic markers passed down to him from father to grandfather. All the males in his bloodlines have passed down this trauma that they experienced in the past so that it's still inside him. We talk about drugs, illegal drugs, prescription drugs is a big problem because, when you're really down and out and you're feeling depressed, a lot of people, that's what they turn to. And then, of course, the Lazarus effect. The fact that black women have a predisposition against him because of mistakes and mistreatment by males in the past of black women. So, regardless of his virtue, he is unable to engage them without sacrificing his self-respect. Thus, men in each generation end up committing the same violations that created a problem in the past generation. It just keeps getting worse. It's like, men are blaming their mothers for what they did to the fathers. Women are blaming their fathers for what they did to the mothers. They start their adult life like that, and there's no chance for relationships to grow. Those are the internal catalysts. So I don't want to give you the impression that all of the catalysts were negative. The majority of the catalysts are positive. We're not talking about them yet. And we're not listing them. I don't want you to think that they don't exist. They do. In order for us to get to the next video, to get to the next place, we got to cover all this negative stuff first, because we want you to see how to properly get a real accurate idea of what and who the black man is today and why. Okay? He has achieved a lot of fine accomplishments. There's no doubt about that, and we don't want to dismiss that. So let's start with economics. So men are measured based on wealth and success, not based on their effort. This has always been true of all men. What you have, though, is you have a bunch of black men who have skills, creativity, and potential. Other black men don't see that. Other black men only look at and recognize what you've already accomplished, your wealth and your existing success. And thereby they do not understand, they do not appreciate, they do not perceive the reality of the collective of black men. This is a problem, and it's been a problem because, the black man looks around and he sees a bunch of other poor men like him and doesn't understand that there's a potential there if he could look past the obvious to see it. And it's created a lot of internal discord because black men feel pressured to obtain money by any means necessary, including criminal means. And often criminal enterprise is the only thing open to them. So, they're like, let's go ahead and take the easy path. When, if the truth be known, with the type of talent he's surrounded with, if he collectively put this into motion, he could create his own economic enterprise that would be far more wealth producing and asset building than the criminal ones. Let's look at epigenetics. Well, first of all, let me just say this. This is the same mentality that Africans had when they sold other Africans into slavery. They were looking at the I mentality. What's good for me? Instead of looking at the strategic, long-term view. In other words, they were looking to make a quick buck and get an advantage over other men. And they did not see, because they were looking at the I and not the we, that this would have disastrous overall consequences for them. So when you look at blacks selling other blacks into slavery, we see the same dynamic today when we see that blacks created all these banks and they sold them. You never sell banks because banks determine who gets a chance to succeed and who don't. If you don't have banks that you could control, you can't control your future prosperity. It's a cultural thing, not an economic thing. And, these are mistakes that blacks have made, that Africans have made, that haunt them. And they're not an outside thing that they don't have control over. It's an internal dynamic that helps to define who you are and what your next step should be. When we look at epigenetics, same thing. Epigenetics, we have the generations before us defining who we are. To a limited extent, we pass on the impact of trauma and past experience to the next generation. Most of this is good. The African gene pool is excellent. And it's probably some of the best genes on the planet. But there are a few critical drawbacks. And I want to mention one of them right now. So we know that there are certain health things that men pass down to their sons, tendencies toward diabetes, high blood pressure, things like that. And we notice that there's a lot of anger and a lot of dissension and stuff that are passed on. Because basically you got 8 generations of men passing on their frustrations and their struggles and their pain and their suffering from all of these generations before. So what you find is that this gets passed on, and the current generation has a hard time with unity because it's constantly expressing the dissent, anger, and frustration of all of these generations before it. Most of the problems in black society with men does not originate in this current lifetime. It's basically dead people having passed on their genes and still expressing this unresolved conflict that they had, unresolved trauma. And there's one epigenetic thing that I have to mention that is, probably more destructive than the others. In the bloodlines of some black men, we will find genetic predispositions to sexually abuse females. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, but we shouldn't ignore it. It exists. People want to say that black people got this from whites. No. This is something that predates blacks even coming into contact with whites. It exists for all men of all races, and it's probably thousands of years old, because men in most countries and most societies looked down on women and found it easy to abuse them. And so what you have is that it's actually become a genetic marker in some bloodlines. Now, it's much more pervasive, in Asians and whites, in my opinion. But it definitely was there in African ancestry. And it's an African thing. It's not from outside of Africa. It was made worse by religions who look at women as inferior to men. But still, there's really no excuse for it except to say men thought it was okay to mistreat women, and they should not have. So, it's less than 10% of the men who have this in their bloodline, but that's 10% too much, because they've created a really, really bad problem. And we're going to talk about that when we get to the relationship discussion. Because, 10% of men with this predisposition to abuse women, have messed up things for the whole group of men. So let's look at the impact of these 98 years of decline. What's the consequence? What's the outcome of it? And that's a lot. And we're going to get to this in future videos in this series. But the impact that I see as being the most important is that it's changed the man in such a way that he's lost the will to focus and engage on male stuff. He's disconnected, he's withdrawn. As we said before, he's indifferent. The black man has stopped seeking to build nations and communities and families and organizations. Number 2, the black man has given up on love. Number 3, the black man has given up on a spiritual solution. He used to think in terms of spiritual solutions to stuff. Now he no longer does that. This is a big, big problem. There's some lessons learned in all of this. Black men have learned that he will never be included in white society. Donald Trump has made that clear finally to some black men. I think for a long time they kept dreaming that they were going to be part of America, but by now I think they understand that's just not going to happen. He's got to build himself or move overseas. But currently he is doing nothing. He is idle. He is idle. The second lesson learned is religion. He has learned that religion does not equal commerce with God. He knows there has got to be more. He just hasn't decided yet what that is. But he has lost faith in spiritual solutions to everyday problems. Not good. Religion, let's face it, is a failed model. Over the last 98 years, during this decline, religion has offered no value to the black man. The black man, I think, the majority of them are finally seeing this. They're not looking to the church anymore as a solution. Some of them are, reluctant to let the church go because it's like a cigarette habit. You feel like if you're letting the church go, you're letting God go, but that's not the case. people used to believe that religion was the only path to God, but they're finding that is the least productive path to God. Most religions don't have a connection to the holy man or whatever the original movement. The current Christianity has no connection to the original movement started by Jesus. Islam has no connection to the original movement started by the prophet. That ended some 100 years after he died. And this is the case with Judaism, the Abrahamic religion, all of the major religions, Buddhism. They're not connected to the original source. But it's hard for people to let that go. And, of course, the religious organizations have spent billions and killed millions to ensure that people would continue to believe that it had a connection to God, even though, because they didn't want to give up that power and that money. Relationships. I think that black men have learned that monogamous relationships with toxic women do not work. That again has been a really hard lesson for him to learn. They just didn't want to learn it. I think he has become aware that all of this, the damage from all of this rape and abuse of women is a big problem. I don't think he really understood how bad this was, but I think the current generation does, that this is a really bad thing. It's really screwed up everything. And that, something needs to be done about it. But the reality is that having learned that lesson, the black man is currently in a Hoover mode. He doesn't know what to do. He's sort of like stopped. He's in stasis. He's, stuck in the water, just kind of floating there in the life jacket. He's not trying to do anything. He's not making any moves. Black men have entered, the popular thing for black men now is the minimum insertion modality. In other words, they find the minimum level of engagement in a relationship, and that's where they position themselves. I'm just enough to be involved with women and have some level of, intimacy, but I'm not trying to insert myself to the point where I'm really committed emotionally, where I'm, in love, where all of this other stuff. I'm not trying to get married. I'm not even really trying to focus on one woman because I can't rely on her. I need a backup. And you can't blame them for this because black women have embraced this mentality, this Lazarus thing, where you can't, it's just not possible to make progress with them. When black men lost their economic foundation after integration in the 60s and 70s, they also lost the black woman. And, she became westernized, she became toxic, and she embraced feminism. And feminism said, this abuse and molestation committed by this under 10% of black men defines all men. And all men have to be treated with a certain level of disdain and blah, 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 blah. And, they created the Lazarus effect where there was no chance for relationships to get better and better and better and to heal. They just kept getting worse and worse and worse, and they're in the pit. The Lazarus effect is this spiraling thing that relationships have gone through for 50 years where they just keep getting worse each generation. Men will not forgive women for what women have done in the previous generations, and women will not forgive men. And therefore, relationships have no chance. And in this, you get into this thing, and so, men get into this mode where they just hover. They're not going to get all the way in, they're not going to get all the way out. And it's like, you can't have a family like that. But they don't really have a choice. And so when you got this Lazarus situation, then you also have a situation where men just aren't motivated because love is not available. They know this. And when love is not available, men seek validation. When validation is not available, they just settle for sex. And that's where all men are now, pretty much. They're dealing with validation and sex. you got maybe 8 or 9% that's still in that love thing, not enough to really create strong black families. And really, they're going to stay there. They're forced to stay there. They can't just give up on relationships completely. But until women change the model and completely reject feminism, nothing furthers. And black men can't reinsert into relationships again. This leaves you with, the final outcome of all of this. Black men have descended into this place where everything is form and nothing is function. It's form over function. And so the psychological condition of the black man is a refugee. He's living in this ring of achievement where it looks like you can do all of this stuff, but it's really not very likely that you're going to get there. He's emotionally indifferent. And you're going to find that his access to sex is deeply reduced. Therefore, in the last 50 years, the incel community, the involuntarily celibate group of black men, is continuously rising. It's reached a crisis now where every quarter you got tens of thousands of black men who are signing up to make these trips overseas to the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Thailand, places like that, just for sex. And even bigger numbers of women, young women, are traveling into the country, into these different cities, to provide sex for these incel community, the black men who are involuntarily celibate because of black women's Lazarus effect. So you got this industry growing every decade, getting bigger and bigger. That's form over function. So, when you look at this thing, this form over function thing, when black men are no longer building because he's lost any hope of love, he stops seeking to achieve lasting function in a relationship. He is only hopeful to achieve the form of it. When love is out of his reach, black men stop making the effort. He basically is checked out. Okay? When a black man is no longer building, when he has lost faith in spiritual systems, which he has, he stops seeking to achieve lasting function in his works. He will only put forth a minimal effort, a limited effort. He's checked out. Therefore, you have form over function because there's no motivation. In form over function, men choose what looks good over what actually works. They are irrevocably driven by appeal, facade, surface stuff, and not the hard stuff underneath. They're not going to make sacrifices. They have zero concern with functionality. They invest money and attention in all things giving them the facade of viability, but not into the stuff that actually will do it for them. They won't invest in groups, organizations, institutions. They're not building them. And they're not going to invest in a book, a class, a relationship mentor, things that make an actual difference. And it's the same thing that they look for in women. They're looking for the surface stuff in women. They're looking for beautiful women who have no functioning abilities. They're pursuing the golden calf, the idol of a woman that, the erotic diva that doesn't have any real purpose, no skills, no creativity. And, when the majority of black men are invested in form and not function, which is the current case, that's a big, big, big red flag. In fact, that's the actual theme of rap music today. Rap music boasts form and we don't need function. That's what they're saying in all of their songs. They're talking about the form, not the function. And they're basically saying we have the form and screw you. We don't want the function and we don't need it. In conclusion today, we've discussed some of the shaping and influencing forces in the life of the black man over the last 98 years. In a purpose is to help us build a framework to help us better define what his current state is and why. This is stage 1 in this series. In the stage 2, we're going to talk about the actual male persona, what he actually has become. How do we define him? We're going to talk about the abnormal male, why he's abnormal, and what is the range of abnormality from here to here. And we're going to talk about the house of the man, the male archetypes, masculine energy, and how that plays into this. So our series begins. There's also going to be a document, almost a book, that supports this series, the Masters series on the black male. Look for it on the website. I think the link is going to be on the front of this thing. I hope so. And you can download the PDF for free, at least until it's published. That's all we got for you today. It's going to be a pretty interesting series, I hope, and I hope that you'll continue to follow me. This is Master Yao. Goodbye.